Hello and welcome to this webinar. Good afternoon to those of you listening in the Asia Pacific region, and good morning to those of you listening in the Western world. My name is Deirdre Fulton. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. And this is the latest in OAG's series of webinars about the impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And welcome back to those of you who've listened before, and of course, welcome to those of you listening for the first time. We'll be taking questions throughout the session today, so please feel free to use the questions panel. If we don't manage to answer your question during or in our allocated Q&A section towards the end, we will do our very best to get back to you over the next couple of days. I'm pleased to be joined today by John Grant, OAG's Senior Analyst, who's been faithfully tracking the impacts of this since it began. And we've also got Mark Clarkson with us today, who's OAG's EVP of Product Management. Welcome to you both.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon.
Hi, good morning.
Okay, so today we're going to try and take a look at the latest position regarding frequency and capacity. So we'll be refreshing some of the data that those of you who've joined us before have seen. And we'll be trying to see if we're seeing any tentative signs of recovery yet. It feels like we've been talking about the potential for green shoots and tentative signs of recovery for a number of weeks now in a sort of aspirational way. So it's going to be good to have a look at some of the data and see whether what we're seeing is actually real recovery beginning. We're going to take a look at cancellation rates as well and see if we're seeing a shift in operational behaviour as schedules tentatively begin to recover. And we're pleased to be able to bring you some insights today as well on some booking snapshots from OAG's Traffic Analyzer tool. And then, of course, as I said, we'll take some questions. We've got an allocated time for that towards the end. So let's dive in. John, we've been looking at this picture now, haven't we? For I sort of want to say weeks, but I feel like we should move into months now. I think we've reached the stage where we're talking about 4 months, aren't we?
Well, we are moving into months, aren't we? We have March, when we have April, and we have May. But yes, we've been going this for probably 14 weeks now, and essentially, for those of you who've not seen this before, this shows the number of flights that have been cancelled in comparison to last year, and obviously the redder the world map, then the higher the level of capacity cuts that we have seen, and you can clearly see the transition from a world that was generally green through to shades of orange and eventually to a pretty dark red situation. But I think the good news is although capacity on a global basis is still down by about 68%, 2/3 of seats and flights not operating, the weekly capacity count, although still below 30 million, actually moved slightly up on Sunday morning. Actually made my weekend for me, standing at 29.8 of all things, standing at 29.8 million, which is a movement in the right direction. And
because 2 weeks ago we were talking 40 million, weren't we? So have we reached the bottom then?
Well, I think so. I mean, that 40 million still had much of the US domestic market capacity in, and as we'll see later, if you're late to the party, as perhaps some of the American capacity cuts were, then once you realize the size and the scale of the operations of the big three legacy carriers and Southwest and JetBlue, etc., suddenly took the market from 40 million down to probably nearer 32 million on their own, and we saw further cuts elsewhere. And that, what we now have is actually 85% of the world's capacity is still within domestic markets. So that international connectivity that facilitates trade, industry, global wealth, economic power, all of those buzz phrases, is still dramatically down on previous years. But we are seeing a bit of an upturn, and there are, someone has said they're not green shoots, but at least the soil has been broken.
So yeah, so different way to think about it, I guess. Okay, let's take a look now then at the picture by region. So what we're showing here are by week flights versus the same week the previous year. And we really wanted to, I guess this sort of nicely highlights what you said there about being essentially late to the party, if that's a good analogy or not. This line here is Asia. So you can see essentially driven by the impact of China putting capacity back into the domestic market. The very steep line, dotted line here is Europe. So deep cuts that have really yet properly to begin recovery, although with lockdowns starting to be lifted across Europe, we hopefully will see that start to pick up. And then North America is this line, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I think what is sort of key takeaways from this are clearly visually, this shows that at least from a capacity perspective, the US or the North American market, which again is predominantly the United States, was somewhere around 2 to 3 weeks behind every other major market in terms of beginning to see significant capacity cuts to their schedule, to the airline schedules. And it also, of course, highlights that because of the Chinese domestic market, which is only around, I think it's 11.5 million seats a week at this moment in time, Asia never quite plummeted to the depths that other markets have seen. The upturn we've got there is, due to not only China. I mean, there's been some growth in the Vietnamese market and domestic markets in the last couple of weeks. And as you said, Deirdre, Europe is essentially still flat. We've seen Wizz Air load and add numerous amount of seats 2 weeks ago and cancel many of those last week with the schedules update. So it's, people are beginning to put some feelers out about capacity and seeing if there's a response. And of course, Michael O'Leary has put back his Ryanair schedules. So that's going to be interesting to see how they play out and whether capacity responds to that. Whether he's actually just playing a game of bluff with the authorities and seeing whether they'll allow those flights to operate and quarantine controls will not be in place is an interesting space.
I think to some extent, I mean, we'll talk about cancellations in a little while, but we did see for a while, didn't we, in both Asia and parts of Asia, certainly the Chinese domestic market and Japan's domestic market, quite high level of cancellations running, didn't we? And then the US for some time as well, we had a sort of high cancellation rate running. I mean, somewhere between, I think, 20 to 30% in China, and at one point in the US we were up at 40%.
Yes, we were. Yeah. Yeah. So it is such a fluid situation, and you have to feel not just for the airlines, but for the airports and all of the infrastructure suppliers and support services, because it is a tough time, and there is just so much uncertainty out there at this moment.
Yeah, still, and I think that's almost the hardest part, isn't it? That uncertainty is going to continue for some time to come yet. Okay, let's take a look at a slightly different image here. So what we're showing here is capacity this time rather than flights. We're showing capacity by day. Day one is the 1st of January 2020 compared to the equivalent day the year before. And we're running through to the 31st of August. So the first 8 months of the year. And this is what is currently shown in schedules, isn't it? So
yes, it is.
A sort of sort of best estimate of a type of recovery, whether it materialises or not.
Yeah. So
what
this
we're
goes.
seeing is sort of
Sorry.
Asia and then China separately.
Yeah, this goes through to the end of the summer program or the summer season at the end of September. So you can clearly see here on the red line how China very early February, mid-February, dramatic cuts in capacity, which coincided, of course, with Chinese New Year, which was interesting. And then after about 3 weeks, that huge injection of domestic capacity back into the market after a 2-week lockdown and subsequent movements along the curve. And when you compare that to the rest of Asia, clearly a difference from around day 31 in China and day 85. So about 54 days later, we began to see those really deep cuts taking place in the rest of Asia, many of which started around Hong Kong and Singapore, and then into Malaysia and other markets as well. And just as they were going down, of course, we began to see China increase its capacity and has continued to increase its domestic capacity to the point where we're at now. But as you rightly say, Deirdre, much of the capacity that we see looking forward looks like it gets back pretty quickly to previous year levels, and that's really a reflection of the fact that the airlines are dealing with today's issues. Today's issues today and next week's issues, and beyond that, they're still trying to gauge and assess what capacity to offer, how strong demand is going to recover, and my instinctive feeling is that we will not be seeing anywhere near those levels of capacity. They are, they're just placeholders at this moment in time. So anyone looking at this, don't run away and think that by day 187 everything will be back to normal, because it certainly
I think we're still, we're in that stage, aren't we now, particularly in parts of Asia where there's a question mark about, is there going to be a second wave? What impact will that have? South Korea, I think, reported, didn't they, towards the end of last week, that there was a small spike up in cases again. And so I guess it's to what extent there's a slight ripple effect of that in terms of pushing back plans perhaps for China to reopen international connectivity. I guess the reality for countries, though, is that there is opportunity, isn't there, to get ready.
Absolutely, and some are beginning to already. We've been approached by some people as we do our consultancy work in Asia already, who are beginning to get ahead of the game and saying, can you help us and advise us on how we build out from where we are, and what markets to focus on, what opportunities. And we've got all of the data that will answer those questions, and obviously happy to discuss any sort of projects or anything like that with anyone. But interestingly, someone has asked already, do we have the global line that we can superimpose on here? And the answer is yes, and we'll probably do that before we send this out as a deck to people. But you can see in the Southwest Pacific, day 91 was a pretty horrible day in the Southwest Pacific, when literally everything collapsed, and we're now beginning to see a recovery. It will be interesting to see what happens with the bubble that is being suggested. I think
it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Because there's I was reading something just earlier this morning actually about the concept of bubble, in terms of there might be other markets around the world where you could use the bubble theory in terms of having corridors of travel that might work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, clearly we have a bubble between the United Kingdom, France and Ireland, because that's not going to be included in quarantine requirements here. So yes,
not that's a bubble that anybody wants to travel in at the moment, but
but it's a bubble that could burst as well. But, so it's quite interesting. But the Southwest Pacific, because of that bubble and because of the very low counts of COVID-19, clearly one of the first parts of the world to be coming out, and some really positive news and developments there. So that's a light at the end of the tunnel, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Just to clarify, day one is the 1st of January this year, not day one of the pandemic, because it would be hard to day one where. So it was the beginning of this calendar year compared to the equivalent day last year. Okay, let's look at the same picture. So we've got the Americas on the left, North America in blue, and Latin America in lilac, and then EMEA on the right-hand side. So interesting, sort of interesting difference here, isn't it? And it's really what we saw on that other chart, isn't it? About slightly later to the party.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting development we've seen in a lot of airlines, and is reflected very well in the Latin American line, is that a lot of airlines put a date out there of around the 1st of June for services being reintroduced, and have stuck to that very hard. So there is still a lot of capacity that appears overnight from the 31st of May to the 1st of June, which is the airlines planning window, I guess, and their initial expectations of when they hope to be back running something to near normal capacity. My personal feeling is that in the next 2 weeks we're going to see some quite significant changes to that, and that we'll see capacity being taken out further. So to your point about, are we at the bottom of the curve, we might be in absolute terms, but there are going to be regional variations, because places like Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile still have large amounts of capacity that has been taken out because of closures of airspace and lockdowns that are continued to occur.
And the reality is it's going to come back in a phased way. Sorry, Mark.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say, I think it just reflects your earlier comment, John, that the airlines are just really thinking about today, tomorrow, and next week more typically, and without any sort of confidence or clarity on, lockdowns or quarantines when they get to those services for the next week, next month. I think the bottom is certainly going to elongate for most regions before we start to build back out.
Yeah,
I think the reality is it is going to be a path like this, isn't it? It's I think it's unlikely that we will see this kind of dramatic.
Yeah, we're going to see a bathtub. Yeah, I think we're going to see bathtub type curves. And I guess it just depends whether it's a 6 foot long bathtub or it's a 2 meter long bathtub as to what we see. But we're certainly not going to see. There was talk about a V shaped curve. Well, I think everyone gave up on that pretty quickly. And there's been talk about a U shape, and there's bathtubs and there's lazy L's and S's and all sorts of things, and J's. But
the whole alphabet of predictions.
Yeah, it's a great time to be a statistician. So remember everything you learned before.
Yeah, there's a comment or a question a short time ago talking about, we're obviously showing capacity and asking the question about demand, which I know we'll cover perhaps a little later on. But I think the challenge right now for the airlines is it's so unprecedented that what do you use to gauge your confidence to build back any of the schedule? So I think it's incredibly challenging for the airlines right now. In some cases, they've got to just effectively take a chance in many markets. And we'll see that, I think, continued pattern of, testing the market, pulling stuff out, levels of cancellations maybe at higher rates for a more consistent period than they have before. All of those things until airlines can really start to understand the market conditions, because it is just so different to anything we've experienced.
Absolutely, and of course, we saw that last week with Wizz Air. But the problem with the suck it and see sort of analogy is a real challenge for the airlines, because you have to resource up your crews, you have to bring aircraft back online that you've put in some remote airfield in France or wherever it happens to be, and then if you're not seeing the capacity, if you're not seeing the demand returning, you get to that horrible situation where you say, okay, do I dump my fares even lower? Do I try and really stimulate the market? What can I do to make this happen? So it's a really, however hard it was going into this, coming out of this, rather like it is for every government around the world, finding a way out is harder than actually diving into it.
And I think that's the tricky thing, isn't it? So all of the sort of strategies and techniques that carriers would use to manage operations efficiently are being challenged, aren't they? So, in the last 2 or 3 days, I've seen lots of stories of, passengers on very, very busy planes in different parts of the world. And the narrative is typically, wait a minute here, what about social distancing and all the things that we're hearing about other, other avenues, shopping, public transport, etc. And I think the reality is that in some cases, cancellations being driven by the lack of demand have forced a situation where you've then got really full planes.
Absolutely, but
and I think we're going to be in this kind of turbulent period, aren't we, for a while?
We are, and sudden changes in government policy or press speculation that changes a traveller's mindset can be quite dramatic. So, that there's been lots of pictures about a flight from Belfast to London Heathrow that was middle seats were full, etc., and social distancing. It's quite likely that less than 3 days before that flight departed, that the flight was looking pretty empty, and then there was a change and a perception that the rules were going to be relaxed around lockdowns, and suddenly lots of people who work in another part of the country and want to get back and start earning some income are suddenly buying seats, and before the airline can adjust its revenue management parameters or do anything about it, it's suddenly sold 180 seats on a 185 seat aircraft. It's just one of those things we're going to have to work our way through. Anyway,
I think I think it points even more to airlines and airports just having to be so joined at the hip to help each other come back through this, because as much as a real challenge for airlines, for airports, if they're having to plan out the whole supply chain, not just their own staff, but their whole, airport services, airport partners, all the stakeholders, here's the capacity coming back, or here are the routes coming back, flying at these times of the day, and they're going to try and build all that back. And then if the airlines are still having to, run at a slightly higher level of cancellations because they just don't know what the market's doing, it just points to, I think, the sharing of data, the sharing of information to help each other find their way back out.
And and a couple of people have made the point about some countries and markets are saying that they're not going to allow international travel until 2021. Australia being an example. Timothy, thanks for that question. And Christian's asked David King's asked a very similar sort of question. But many domestic networks, as KK from Cebu Pacific alluded to when he joined us for one of these webinars, rely on domestic services, rely on international connectivity and international connections for those routes to be sustainable. There are numerous places in Asia, such as Bangkok and Malaysia, where the international connecting traffic is absolutely vital to the frequency of service that you see on some city pairs. And without that international connectivity, markets will be
stack up, does it?
No, just do not stack up. And it's the same in Africa, around places like South Africa, where without the international connectivity and all of those international passengers flying from Johannesburg to Cape Town or Durban, the frequency that they enjoyed previously may not be there. Although, of course, with South African Airways not operating, it might not be there anyway. So,
okay, let's take a look at some of our country-specific data now. So again, those of you who've joined us before will be familiar with this one. So this really shows us, doesn't it, the situation clearly in China with capacity at an almost, I don't want to use the word unprecedented, but in terms of this, the path of this crisis, we haven't seen any other market yet, I don't think, with just, and my just is in inverted commas, 27% down on last year. So that's a real boost back, isn't it, in terms of capacity into the market?
It is, and it's interesting because there has been this steady trend, and there was the early May bank holiday in China, which was a 5-day public holiday, and there was a lot of analysis and commentary around whether there would be any pickup in Chinese travel, and there has. There's pieces of analysis that have already been published, and I'm sure more will follow, confirming that there was more than the usual number of Chinese travellers around the 1st to the 5th of May. But I think a large proportion of those are actually surface or high-speed train or car rather than air. There's still plenty of spare capacity around. But I think if you look at those numbers closely, you do begin to see some little chinks of optimism. Vietnam 3 weeks ago, only 30% of previous year's capacity, now at 56% as the domestic market has reopened. India this week has tentatively allowed or eased restrictions on domestic flights. So that's a big jump back that the airlines have put in, and they're clearly, it's a very big domestic market anyway. Similarly, in Malaysia, we've seen an improvement because of an easing of restrictions. And in Hong Kong, Cathay Pacific, Cathay Dragon have added back about 90,000 seats this week. Double daily Heathrow, where it was only single last week, and such things. So we're beginning to see some little bits around the world and snippets in Asia. Philippines, unfortunately, will probably go backwards a little bit now because Cebu Pacific had 100,000 seats operating this week, but have now decided to suspend all operations until the end of May. So they'll be coming back out again. So that just goes to show how much churn there really is taking place and still taking place in the market.
Yeah, John, just the point previously about the importance of international connectivity and appreciating all these country markets are at their own different stage on the curve, as it were. Just looking at that as an illustration, the market is at the top, very, very large, strong domestic markets. The ones down the bottom typically relying upon connectivity. So we mentioned Malaysia, Philippines to an extent, UAE, absolutely. Australia, reasonably strong domestic market, but a lot of connectivity. In Hong Kong, obviously, all connectivity, but not even like near Hong Kong. So most of the connectivity is to from markets that are 4+ hours away. So regardless of the curve and where everyone else is at, this might be a sort of repeating pattern that those markets that rely on the connectivity are going to be slower to build back.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course it depends on the government strategy. So domestic capacity in some markets has reached almost zero. I think we only have 3% of domestic capacity in the United Kingdom compared to what we had in January, which is staggering. And similarly in France, Air France's government bailout is dependent upon more traffic being switched to high-speed train services and reducing domestic flying. So every country handles this so differently, and of course that's why the airlines are in a state of confusion when there's no consistent messaging coming from anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're making the point there about some markets being more reliant on international connectivity than others. There's an interesting question that I think that's quite relevant from Peter about Middle East airlines, who of course are hugely dependent on international connectivity globally. They're promoting schedule starts in June and July. So are we going to see a different pace of potential recovery there,
Well,
or are
yeah.
they going to be they're going to be hindered, aren't they, by?
Well, it is very interesting, isn't it? Because and Peter listens to lots of these webinars and always chips in with a good question, so thank you for that. But firstly, it's been interesting during this period that there has been low frequency connectivity supplied by many of the Middle East carriers from Australia down to or up to Europe and vice versa, and obviously pretty rigid travel restrictions about who can and who cannot fly on those services, and many of them have been repatriation. Hopefully Emirates flight from Dubai is landing with a very valuable goalkeeper who my football team need in case the Premier League starts in the next couple of weeks.
Moving swiftly on from
so
the
hopefully
football
that lands.
analogy.
But it is a very valid point. You know, the Middle East is actually the fulcrum, the pivot point for traffic from both sides, eastbound and westbound. And if the eastbound services, you know, can operate freely, those to Europe and other destinations, but capacity is closed off in Asia and markets are still in lockdown stages, or vice versa, then actually the model is broken, because you can't carry those sixth freedom passengers through on their whole journey. And you know, for many of those Middle East airlines, not just the Middle East airlines, but well, the Middle East airlines generally, but you know, just one specific example, Gulf Air do not have a huge network to Asia, but they do have a daily Manila service, and that is probably 70% connecting traffic from Europe, and it would not survive if they could not operate to Manila, for instance.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, John. Let's just take a look at the visual representation of those numbers. So we see China, the positive potentially in India. Japan we've talked about before, so a much slower, more considered reduction, but still, as we'll see shortly, running with high cancellations, aren't they?
Unusually high, almost unheard of high levels of cancellation in Japan. I mean, the yearly OAG on-time performance results come out around the 3rd or the 4th of January consistently show Japanese airlines and Japanese airports with the highest rankings in the world. So for them to be running with 20% cancellation rates is just completely against the culture and the way the country works. It just must be very odd. But then, there is a very big market, and until recently it was still quite strong, and there was quite a bit of demand there. But it was a market domestically, it was a market that was created just purely on the basis of local demand. It was one of the very few markets in the world with a high volume of domestic traffic that was not connecting to another international point. There was very little historically transfer connectivity, and in fact, Japan really didn't have an international to an international type hub network, with Narita and Haneda. And ironically, Haneda would have changed that this March with its additional slots and its new network of services that were being created for the Olympics.
I think
it will come back.
I think what will be really interesting to watch is, and we're going to, I'm stealing my own thunder here by going on to talk about some of the things that are going to come up. But, we're sort of hearing that domestic's obviously going to recover more quickly, but we're also hearing that, surface and other modes of transport, so road and rail essentially, are tapping into making customers feel safer. So instead of flying domestically, maybe people will choose to take land alternatives. Now, Japan is an interesting conundrum, isn't it? Because it has this massive domestic air market, but it also has high-speed rail. And will we see? I'm not sure we will. We're not seeing any evidence of that yet. But will we see a shift? As this sort of pandemic unfolds?
But
So it'd be interesting
it
to
will be
watch.
interesting. Some of it will be forced clearly, and in France, for example, as I mentioned, that's a point. And someone said, you know, there's a question around there are always positives out of this and any crisis, and perhaps one of them is we reevaluate both the sustainability angles of commercial aviation, but also the use of other modes of transport. But you have to have capacity in the system. I mean, I nearly experienced the bullet train when I was in Japan. One of my colleagues was planning the trip. Didn't
One
quite
day,
work as we
one day,
didn't
you'll
quite
get to
work
try
as
it, John.
thank you. Didn't quite work as we expected. But the fact is, Japan's high-speed rail network runs with an amazingly high occupancy rate already, and you couldn't accommodate all of the existing demand for domestic air travel into the existing railway network. You would have to find ways of, you know, increasing frequency of service and switching people, which would be really, really challenging, potentially possible over a long period of time, but a challenging conundrum for transport planners for sure. So I think if it's good that we're evaluating, and you know, there are always good things that come out of a crisis. We might not realize it whilst we're living the dream or the nightmare, but we do see these things eventually.
Yeah. Okay. Let's quickly look at the last four here. So we've talked about them in some depth already, haven't we? But this sort of nicely illustrates the planned recovery, doesn't it, in Vietnam? And I guess also shows what we think that's going to spike back down again, isn't it, in the Philippines?
And interestingly, in the context of the competitive environment, by virtue of Vietnam seeming to have passed through COVID-19 relatively unscathed, and beginning to see more capacity coming back online, there, in the wider context of tourism and economic activity, by being ahead of the curve, if you compared this to somewhere like Thailand, for example, there is an opportunity, and the tourism product, there is perhaps an opportunity for Vietnam to begin to move ahead and secure those early international bookings from Europe and North America and other parts of the world, whilst Thailand is still coming through that recovery phase. So people in the Vietnamese Tourist Board should now really be thinking about how do they take advantage of what looks like an earlier recovery than some of their major competitors.
Yeah. Okay. Right, let's move on now to I feel like we've almost already talked about these. So what I think is really interesting is we mentioned earlier in China's domestic market operationally, we saw cancellation rate running at nearly 30%. That was just 2 weeks ago, and it's coming down. You know, I mean, typically globally the cancellation rate before all of this ran at about 1%, didn't it? On average overall. So this is still very high, but it's considerably better than it was, and I guess it shows that potentially in China, airlines are getting closer to finding that optimum level of capacity, aren't they?
Yeah, and this is also that point about, you know, the airlines are testing the market, and only when they test it can they identify what the real demand is. Problem is, you know, it's a very expensive test to get back online, put the flights in the systems and resource them up. But they seem to have got a bit more control over it. Whereas in Japan, in the last 6 weeks, we've seen a very unusual level of cancellations for that particular market. Whilst Vietnam and to an extent South Korea have done a really good job of matching at least operations with very low cancellation rates in both cases. Now, we still do not know, and we will not know for a period of time, what the actual passenger numbers were and what the load factors were on those services. But you've got to think that certainly in a domestic market where there is high frequency between the two major cities in both Vietnam and South Korea, that they would, if there wasn't demand, they would just cancel a flight and roll passengers onto the next one, which might be 30 minutes later, particularly South Korea, the biggest domestic market in the route in the world is. I think Jeju to Seoul Gimpo. So
Yeah.
there's also maybe point a little bit to the size of the domestic market here as well, that obviously China and Japan versus Vietnam and Korea to some extent. China, I think at its peak was running around sort of high 20% in terms of cancellations in February. But even although we're kind of getting back to a period of normality, cancellation rate is still like 6 to 10 times what it was before.
Yeah.
And how long, that's quite a long period now we've had where it's been bumbling along at the 10, 12, 14%.
Yeah.
So back to our earlier kind of conversation, is that how much longer or how long will that be sustained? Because that's got a fairly, 1 in 10 flights being cancelled is a fairly significant impact for the whole chain of events, not just the airline. And in a market as large as China, that's still going to be significant disruption.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. And to what extent is to what extent does the traveller accept, and I think we've talked about this before, that that's just a precondition now of travelling by air, that there will be cancellations, there will be disruption, things will take longer than they ever did. I think the impact is greater, isn't it? So I think what I'm trying to say is that I think the passenger is probably more accepting of that. I think the reality, though, for airlines is how sustainable is it to operate in that way on a sort of continued basis. It's not, is it?
it's not, because ultimately, you're building into your operating model a huge amount of fixed cost in terms of aircraft leasings, things like that you're keeping in your fleet that you might otherwise either return or send to Alice Springs for a suntan. So lots of cost they can't is the simple answer.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. We're going to stay in China for a moment. Now, we thought this was an interesting piece. So McKinsey put out a piece, I think yesterday or the day before, which was really focused on looking at the Labor Day holidays in China. And what they showed here using OAG capacity data was obviously, what we've seen in the charts that we've been looking at in terms of this sort of gradual recovery. But what they've overlaid that with is the hotel occupancy rate, which, although considerably below last year, does show that continued recovery as well. And I've sort of seen in other places, predictions about how that will just continue to pan out through the rest of the year.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because ultimately we're in a situation where hotel occupancy rates we don't know how many rooms are available, what the separation criteria are, whether they can only sell 50% of rooms, etc., etc. But it gives a bit of assurance, I think, that it's not just people traveling to family homes, but the hotels are beginning to see some trade, and generally when people are in hotels, they tend, a proportion of them are tourists who are visiting locations. We've seen pictures of Chinese nationals at iconic tourist spots in the last couple of weeks as well. So it's another one of those little measurements that give us some optimism, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And then we followed that up with the next graphic from their piece too, because we thought this was interesting and sort of picked up on this sense that there's a shift, isn't there? So what they found was that this was a C-Trip piece that came out, again talking about the trends, that long haul destinations, so Sanya is sort of China's equivalent of Hawaii, which is a resort area on Hainan, and you have to fly there. And actually, it featured really top of the list in the top 10 travel destinations last year, but was notable by its absence this year, picking up on that point that popular destinations are those that can be reached not just by air, but by high-speed rail and alternatives. And I guess we've overlaid this with this is capacity data just for the 1st of May for the top 10 in 2019, 1st of May, and then the top 10 this year. And you can see a similar shift, can't you, in terms of the destinations that have become higher up the list. And I think Shanghai is an interesting one too, because there was another piece I was reading this morning about Shanghai has had a notably low rate of infection and is trying hard, I think, to campaign for opening back up international connectivity on that basis. That's a really difficult premise, isn't it?
Everyone is making premises, Deirdre, and you just we work our way through this. I think it's fascinating as well. I mean, you think about the situation in Beijing where last November they opened the brand new airport. There was a huge master plan around changing airline operations, building Beijing into a gateway to the world and a major, 2 major hub airports. But you can see the impact of the lockdown, because Beijing, while Shanghai, was relatively unscathed, Beijing had a very stringent lockdown, and you can see that it moved from 2nd to 6th in the list, and you'd never expect to see Beijing in that position in a Chinese piece of domestic analysis.
Okay. Let's move on to the last segment now. So we're going to bring you some insights from Traffic Analyzer. Mark, do you want to talk us through what the context of those are?
Yeah, sure. I think it was part of our sort of response to what our customers have been asking for and what we could best do in the shortest time to add more functionality into the tool that would allow customers maybe to have a better view on the context around the future bookings. So people may ask, well, the future bookings are not going to tell us anything because they're just not there, but understanding the context of what those future bookings are against, i.e. a normal year, so last year, so looking forward from this point in time, last year, what were the future bookings looking like compared to what they are now, and I think that's going to be pretty valuable coming out the other side because of all the things we've talked about in terms of future capacity, more sustained cancellation rates. But what are the core bookings underlying that? Because as we've seen already, airlines are maybe taking a chance to throw in extra capacity, but then the demand is not coming back as quickly, and that is playing a part in cancellations or reduction in service or aircraft size. And I think that's going to get even more fluid as we start to build back out. So that's essentially the kind of use case behind us bringing that capability into the platform.
Okay. And we've pulled some examples, haven't we, just to sort of try and illustrate some of the data that's available. We'd probably need a whole webinar to itself to really do it justice, wouldn't we? But we wanted to just bring some of those insights. So what we have here is we looked at the current position, so future bookings in May 2020. At a country level, and then for the top 5 routes by capacity for travel from May to October 2020. And we then looked back using the historical snapshot to say, well, in May 2019, what was the booking position for travel in May to October 2019? And not surprisingly, we saw a significant reduction, I think, across all 3 of the markets that we looked at. So this is the picture. So 94% less bookings this May compared to the same picture last May. And then at a route level, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that there's obviously you can sort of see there's a trend there, but Kansai Incheon in particular seems to be rising above that slightly. Now there might be different things going on there, mightn't there, John?
Yeah. Why don't you
market.
take a slug of water, Deirdre, and I'll help
Yeah.
you through this. So this is quite interesting because from some of the work we've done for some clients in Japan, we know that there are large group bookings that occur, and these are probably still in the various reservation systems. But I think one of the real interesting takeaways for me from all of this is, if you keep at the back of your minds, airlines generally are going to be looking in a normal world at passenger load factors of about 84–86% to break even and begin to return to profitability. And of course, notwithstanding the fact that, you know, there is probably large pent-up demand waiting to book when there is a bit more confidence, this would be telling me that if I was an airline, I probably want to be cutting about half of my capacity that I had last year if I am going to try and achieve those 80% load factors that I have traditionally sought, and gives you some idea of the scale of cuts that might be necessary. And it also points out, of course, those routes where there is perhaps, you know, a stronger historic demand, and therefore confidence that it will come back earlier. And I think in all of the three slides we've got for you here, it's interesting that Incheon, and specifically Incheon, but South Korea performs so well.
Yeah, we see that, don't we?
Yeah. Not on that one, of course, it's on the next one.
Yeah, that's on this one, isn't it? It's on
Hong Kong Incheon. Yeah, performs so much better and stronger than any of the others, which seems to, you know, there's clearly some wider Asian perception that South Korea has seen its way through this.
Yeah, although if you look back at the last three slides, then aside from Hong Kong and Incheon, most of the routes featuring Hong Kong are still, you know, really at the bottom of the pile, and even at the Japan, you've got that kind of drop back there for Narita Hong Kong as well.
But Mark, just a question from Scott: these are bookings that are in the system, so these are not necessarily made in the last couple of weeks. These are the ones that have been baked in, aren't they?
Yeah, although I think we're starting now to see more dynamic changes for, you know, the next 2-3 months out, as you know, travellers, whether business or leisure, are starting to make those changes.
It is a snapshot, so you can actually, Scott, you can actually take a snapshot last month versus this month, so you can see the curve and the accelerated rate of bookings that are coming through. So, you know, it's very useful from that perspective to see if there's more confidence out there.
And there's another question just saying, are these bookings e-bookings or all bookings? Well, these are the bookings in the core GDS, so it's not all bookings. And naturally, in some markets, the GDS have a higher penetration than others. But it's essentially at least giving you some sort of view, some sort of confidence on underlying demand in some of those markets. And, you know, some of the markets we've touched on just now, you know, the GDS penetration still is very high, so it is a good indicator to help make better decisions about what's coming down the path.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. I think I'm conscious of time. We've got sort of 5 minutes left of our allocated time, and we've got loads of questions still to get through. Let's take a look at some of those questions. This is an interesting one. Back to China again. Do we think that the trend of the China curve, so domestic travel, could be used as a reference for recovery scenarios in Europe, or is the Chinese market so sort of uniquely different?
I I don't think we can look at China as being a great benchmark for every other market, because there are just so many variables around each and every country. And they range from the most simple things of apparently simple things such as government policy, through to the number of airlines operating, the levels of competition, the mix of domestic versus international capacity. Every market will have its own curve and its own recovery pattern. You know, low-cost airlines clearly are being quite aggressive in the amount of capacity they're putting back very quickly, particularly in Europe, or two of the leading low-cost airlines are at least adopting that strategy. So I think if we can learn anything from China, that would be really useful, but we shouldn't take it as a benchmark for how everywhere else will work its way through this process. But it's a fascinating piece of analysis that you can run to see the differences.
Yeah. Okay.
Someone asked what is the best tool that you should use to sort of forecast the recovery out of this, and apart from Mystic Meg's crystal ball, which probably isn't available in most parts of the world without a heavy license fee, I think you've got to trust your own intuition and data points, you know, and some of the data in OAG is extremely valuable in that it is the first glimpse that we have from a global perspective on the total airline picture. You know, every Sunday morning it's there, and on Monday morning we post a blog and put some data behind that as well, and we have a dedicated COVID page now. So there's lots of stuff there, but you should take information from a number of sources, I think, and create your own blend of whiskey or whatever it is that gives you a feeling of how the market is coming back, and you know, just treat every piece of optimism with a bit of caution, because as we've seen, it can quickly close down again if events turn against us.
Yeah, we just sort of building on that a little bit, one of the questions we had was about demand for air travel being heavily dependent on how airlines and airports address hygiene factors, and we've sort of touched on some of that. We actually, after the last webinar, we conducted a survey, and we'll be sending the survey out again this time to everybody. So please take a moment or two when you get that to just give us your thoughts on the questions. But we showed that the last survey showed that the top 3 things that people thought were sort of going to be required or relevant were disinfecting the aircraft on turnaround, thermal screening at airports, and virtual queuing apps for check-in and boarding, because that sort of operational management is going to be critical, isn't it? You know, those 3 areas, you can see getting that right actually will make it work, or not, you know, in terms of what we were talking about earlier about cancellations and the speed of time to get through the airport.
You know, many legacy airlines and full service carriers used to talk about those touch points with their customer, you know, those moments when they put 10 seconds of engagement with their customer. Well, the reality is the customer wants to engage with 0 seconds at the moment. And to that effect, Ryanair yesterday said that in their new travel or their new network and bookings, they will only accept electronic boarding cards, passes. So you can no longer even print out your boarding card pass at home. It has to be on a mobile. And we're going to see a lot of those types of changes to the way business is conducted. And this will probably drive a huge amount of technological development that has been, you know, just either too expensive or just out of the reach of airlines and airports is going to be forced on them to build back the confidence that people want.
And that's going to be driven by individual government behaviour as well, isn't it? You know, in terms of will we see, we've talked before, haven't we, about the need for consistent application of first of all, standards in terms of hygiene factors and everything else, but also a consistent approach to border control.
Yeah, and that is the devil in all of this, Deirdre. I saw this morning. We keep saying this morning because it is so early here in Europe that ICAO hope to publish their first set of guidelines and standards by the 31st of May as to how we live in this new world. Well, excuse me, gentlemen, we've been living in it for the last 6 weeks, and why weren't these available earlier? Internet industry trade associations, quite frankly, have been woeful in their publicity support of the airline community and their lobbying with various government agencies around the world, and that's just one example. So we need to find consistency in all of this. The fact that these bubbles are great, but when the edge of the bubble is essentially only a strip of tarmac that's 2 meters wide between France and Spain, and people can travel back and forth, and then they come to France and they can fly to Europe unhindered without any quarantine, makes a mockery of what we're trying to say. It's shambolic. And it's not helping the airlines, and you can completely empathise with people like Willie Walsh, who incidentally looked like he had a bad cold when he was doing that interview earlier this week, and Michael O'Leary, because they're actually just saying what all of us, I think, in the industry feel, and it's about time we got it sorted.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there for today, unless there are any final thoughts either of the panel want to share.
Question about anything on Africa. Yeah, I mean, Africa is still very much in a lockdown state. It's clearly got some major issues around the airline community with carriers in Chapter 11 or the equivalent of, and potential discussions about another new South African Airways as it comes out of Chapter 77. Chapter 11 7 times this week. So lots of things there, but it's the challenge for Africa, of course, is that it's just not about the aviation industry. It's about what it does to the economy and prosperity and famine and all of these horrible things that are still to be realised as we got to come out of this before we see the damage there. I think there's one last thing I'd like to pick up on, Deirdre, which is what Peter mentioned about insurance. And one of the big barriers to travel we're going to see in the coming months is going to be about insurance and insurance premiums, because they're going to be phenomenally more expensive than they were this time last year, and that is going to suppress demand on its own. And the insurance companies probably need to think long and hard about, do they offer a competitive price for an insurance product, or do they just price it so high that people travel without insurance, which is a huge risk in some parts of the world.
Yeah, and I guess for corporate travel, that's really significant, isn't it?
All of those things as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, John. Mark, any final thoughts?
No, nothing further from me. I think it's just it's a great conversation, and I mean we could carry on for a long time, but I think we should probably just cut it here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If we haven't managed to answer your question, although I think we've got through a fair number of them, as I said earlier, we'll do our best to reply to that in the next couple of days. And a recording of the webinar will be coming out to all of you later today. Thank you to the panel for your, as ever, fascinating insights. And of course, thank you to all of you listening in and for your questions. As John mentioned earlier, you can follow OAG's tracking of COVID-19. There's a dedicated webpage on the website with regular updates on capacity and how we think that's impacting on the industry. We'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.